Here we are, AP Biology, Chapter 21. This chapter is dedicated to digestion of nutrition or nutrition and the process of digestion for getting that nutrition. This is video 1. We're going to just kind of focus on a general overview of what nutrition and digestion are and the different methods for it, and then we'll start describing the process of that digestion. So I'm trying something new in this video. I have the blanks, but I will be talking about how to fill in those blanks. So what you can see in this picture are these krill. So getting their fill of krill takes an enormous amount of this tiny little microscopic fish known as krill. And in order to support a 72-ton humpback whale, the marine mammal, so the whale itself, has to eat these teeny tiny little fishes and crustaceans called krill. And it has to eat it by the truckload. 72-ton humpback whale is living off of these teeny tiny little fish. And so it's constantly feeding. How does it feed? Well, what they do is the humpback whales strain their food from the ocean water, and they don't have teeth. What they have is this large mouth full of these like plates that are lined up, almost like a domino effect, and those are called baleen. And what the baleen does is that all of these plates are attached to the upper side of their jaw, so this baleen is there, and they open their mouth and they just suck in all the water, fish, and anything that comes with it. And so at the end of a typical day, the whale has consumed, just by siphoning things through their baleen, it will have consumed as much as 2 tons of fish. 2 tons is what it has to eat. And it gets that not by chewing, but by simply filtering through the baleen. Now, another example of how things can obtain and process food is there are really kind of crazy diets. So if you're an herbivore, you're a plant eater. So turtles are herbivores, they'll eat plants. Carnivores are meat eaters. And then omnivores will eat both plants or other animals. But that's not the only way. You can't just be an herbivore, a meat-eating carnivore, or an omnivore. What's going to happen is that some animals will use different mechanisms, and some of them use what's called suspension feeding, which simply means that they'll eat whatever they bump into. So plants, like in figure 21A, it's sedentary, it's in the ocean, so whatever little thing kind of crashes into it is what it feeds on. Whereas substrate feeding is you eat whatever is directly below you, so like a caterpillar eats a leaf that it's attached to. You can have fluid feeding, like mosquitoes, they suck the blood. Or you can have bulk feeding, and bulk feeding is like what those giant pelicans will do, or herrings. They'll just reach in and grab a whole fish and swallow it down. Now, when we talk about feeding, we're talking about consuming food, and that's the first process, kind of is the general overview of how we process food for nutrition. So the 4 steps that happen, the first thing you have to do is ingest. So you have to get the food into your system. The second thing that's going to happen is you're going to digest that food. Now, digestion could be mechanical or chemical or both. And once that food is broken down into small enough molecules, what's going to happen is that the cells that make up your body are going to have to absorb those molecules, those nutrients. And then whatever your body doesn't want or doesn't need will then be eliminated from the body. Now, this process is kind of varied depending on what organism you're looking at. And so I want to focus for a second on the digestion part, the part where we're taking things and we're breaking it down. This goes back to our basic understanding of polymers or macromolecules. So when we eat a piece of bread, we're eating protein, we're eating starch, we're eating molecules that are found in the food. And so what we're doing in the digestion is we're breaking down those polymers, so the starch, and we're turning it back into the monomer that makes it up. So if you eat a piece of chicken that's high in protein, you're going to break it down in digestion to amino acids. If you eat a starch, you're going to break it down into monosaccharides. If you eat nucleic acid, you're going to turn it into individual nucleotides so that our body can use those to construct the molecules that we need for our cells and to function. Now, so in chemical digestion, we are breaking down our food into monomers. How does this happen? Well, it turns out that digestion is going to occur in these specialized compartments. So we have small areas that are designed for doing one part of the digestion. Now, the food that's digested in the compartments, often what happens is inside those compartments, we're housing something called hydrolytic enzymes. Hydrolytic enzymes are proteins that can help us digest our food. Now, the idea is that we want to digest our food using these enzymes entirely down into the individual monomers that were found in the food. Now, this is different because if we look at something like a cnidarian or a flatworm, what happens is that their digestive compartment is this one big gastrovascular cavity. Okay, so there is only one opening, and that's the mouth. So whatever comes into the mouth goes in. It gets digested. All of that nutrients get kind of absorbed or diffused into the cells that line that cavity. And then whatever we don't want, whatever we don't need, goes right back out that mouth. And so this is a compartment for that. However, most of the animals that we'll be talking about or focusing on have what's called an alimentary canal. Now, an alimentary canal has an opening and an exit. So, for example, the alimentary canal that runs from the mouth to the anus of a worm is specialized because it has specialized regions or area. So the alimentary canal for an earthworm, if you look at it, you'll see that there's a region that is the mouth. There's a specialized region that's the pharynx. There's a specialized region that's the esophagus. There's a specialized region that's called the crop and the gizzard. There's a specialized region that's known as the intestine. And so most animals have these specialized regions that will do a certain function for the length of their alimentary canal. We're going to focus on the human digestive system. The human digestive system consists of, we have what's called the alimentary canal, but then we also have all of these accessory glands that play a role in digestion but are not directly in the canal. One of the big things is that we rely on muscle contractions of the smooth muscles that are found in the walls of our intestine, that are found in the walls of the esophagus. So we're using muscle contractions or smooth muscle contractions to move the food through the alimentary canal. We're squeezing the food towards the anus or towards the elimination process all the way along the alimentary canal. Now, this movement is called peristalsis. So peristalsis is the muscle movement that happens when you squeeze smooth muscles in the digestive system. So let's start looking at this. There is something called the pyloric sphincter, and it's this little tiny valve or closure area that keeps the food from one compartment entering a second compartment. And the pyloric sphincter is what regulates the passage of food from the stomach into the small intestine. In the stomach, we're doing a lot of our chemical digestion. Once we get into our small intestine, we're continuing the chemical digestion, but now we're starting to do the absorption process. So let's look at the overall process of the digestion of a human system. So digestion is going to begin in the oral cavity, and we're going to use our teeth that's in our mouth, which is our oral cavity. The teeth are going to break up the food, and the saliva that we produce moistens it. So we're taking our food and we're chewing it up to break it up, and then we're going to use our saliva to kind of keep it all moist. Now, the salivary enzyme, so the saliva produces an enzyme that begins the digestion of starch, and that enzyme is called amylase. So we're going to be producing in our saliva the enzyme amylase to start breaking down any starch that we may be eating, which is why if you chew a cracker long enough, it will literally dissolve in your mouth. Then what happens is we're going to use the tongue to push what we now have this moistened kind of chewed up piece of food that we call a bolus, and it's B-O-L-U-S, the bolus, and we're going to push it into the pharynx, which is at the back of our throat. Now, the thing we have to worry about is how we're designed, is that the food and breathing pathways or passages both open into this pharynx. So if we're not careful, the food will go into our breathing tube, which is our trachea, rather than the esophagus, which is our chewing or digestive passage. So the food and breathing passages both open up into your pharynx. So we have what's called the sphincter reflex. And what's happening there is that the food moves from the pharynx into your esophagus while keeping it out of your trachea. And how it works is diagrammed in this figure model. But what you can see is that when your sphincter is contracted, what happens is your esophagus is closed off, and so when you breathe in, it goes into your trachea or your windpipe. What happens when your sphincter is relaxed is that the muscle or this tissue called the epiglottis falls down, and it blocks the trachea and opens up your esophagus. Once your esophagus is opened, then your sphincter contracts with the bolus of food trapped inside. So the epiglottis goes up and down based on whether or not your sphincter, your esophageal sphincter, is relaxed or contracted. However, sometimes problems happen. And what happens here is we have the Heimlich maneuver. The Heimlich maneuver can save lives. And what the Heimlich maneuver does is it moves the food from your pharynx or trachea during choking. So you put too much food, it goes down, it can actually go down your trachea, and by pushing up and doing the Heimlich maneuver, we can actually force the muscles to send that bolus back up into our mouth so that we can get rid of or prevent the choking that happens. Now, what we're going to do is talk about what happens once the food gets into your esophagus, and that's a continuation of the process. So once we're there, the esophagus is going to squeeze food along the stomach or along to the stomach by that muscle contraction that's called peristalsis. So muscles in the esophagus, smooth muscles in the esophagus, are going to move the food into the stomach, and they're going to do it by this rhythmic contraction that pushes the bolus further and further down. That contraction is called peristalsis. Now, once it's in the stomach, we're going to do the breakdown of food, and we're going to hydrolyze it or break it apart with acid and enzymes. There are three things that are found in the gastric juices. There's mucus, there's acid, and then there's enzymes. In order to begin the process of breaking down proteins, we're going to use an enzyme called pepsin. So pepsin is the enzyme that begins the breakdown of proteins or the hydrolysis of proteins. And what also is happening is that gastric juices, those gastric juices, which is mucus, acid, and enzymes, they're going to mix with the food that's in our stomach, and we're going to use that to be producing more and more acid so that we can break it down into something called chyme. And once we have chyme, we then can put it into our small intestine. One of the connections that I want to make about the gastric juices in our stomach is that people can often develop an ulcer. And what they used to think was ulcers were just caused from problems within your body, but now they found out that bacterial infections can actually cause the ulcer. So once a bacterial infection gets into your stomach or your small intestine, what happens is that it causes sores to develop. So the bacteria can cause sores to develop. Those sores are what we call or know as ulcers. And so it turns out that if you don't produce enough mucus to protect the lining of your stomach, or you have a high rate of bacterial infection, specifically the H. pylori bacteria, then you can develop ulcers. I want to talk about what happens once we're from the stomach further down in the process in video 2. So this is where we'll stop.